Lecture 1, Part 2. Does Gurdjieff ever speak or write about negative emotions? Or does he claim instead that the emotional centre in man is divided into pleasant and unpleasant emotions? In the late summer of 1921, Ouspensky left Constantinople as the final stage of his escape from the Russian Revolution, headed for London. Earlier, when Gurdjieff had abandoned his Moscow and St. Petersburg groups in February 1917, Ouspensky eventually heard from him in the summer of 1917 and travelled to Gurdjieff's family home in the Caucasus. Although Gurdjieff never returned to Russia, as Ouspensky did eventually, however, spending the period from the summer of 1917 to 1918 in the vicinity of Gurdjieff in the Caucasus, but gradually separating himself from him and separating, as he explained later, the ideas from the man. In 1918, they became completely separate. In early 1920, after considerable hardships, Ouspensky arrived in Constantinople, and eventually, through a series of fortunate events involving the publication in the West of his earlier book entitled Tertium Organum, he was able to leave Asia and of course all contact with Russia also forever, and travel to London. In London, under the guise of an esoteric teacher bringing a new and even secret doctrine from the East, he was somehow quickly able to organize a number of groups which, it was claimed, most likely truly, had over 1,000 pupils, and which groups ran certainly throughout the 1920s and 30s. The pupils of these groups kept notes and any scraps of written material from these meetings, and after Ouspensky's death in 1947 these were published under Ouspensky's name and under the title of The Fourth Way. This book is therefore clearly a fairly authoritative account by these pupils of what it was that Ouspensky was actually teaching during these influential years. There are, in the index to this book, The Fourth Way, 30 references to negative emotions in a book of about 450 pages. Ouspensky clearly regarded this as a very important part of the teaching. In this book there is much repetition, naturally, but here is one passage selected by me to give you the overall feel for the sense and significance of negative emotion in his work at that time. Here is what he writes. I want particularly to draw your attention to this idea of negative emotion and the state of negative emotion. This is really the second important point. The first referred to consciousness, that we are not conscious and that we can become conscious. And so Ouspensky's first point in his teaching is about consciousness. We shall look at this in the next lecture of mine in this series. His second point, and hence of some importance, concerns negative emotions. They are useless. They are a sign of weakness. We can struggle with them. They can be conquered and destroyed. There is no real centre in man for them. All this is found in Ouspensky's writings. But what did Gurdjieff actually say to Ouspensky about negative emotions? Getting a bit nearer to the source, in the book In Search of the Miraculous, there are 3 references in the index to negative emotions. In a book admittedly of less than 400 pages, one of these references is of no importance to us here, and so we can examine 2 of the references in the index of this book to this topic, which amounts to 3 paragraphs. Let me quote them now. On page 112 of In Search of the Miraculous, Ouspensky quotes Gurdjieff as speaking about the study of our habits and of the associations of the moving centre. He then goes on to say, in the sphere of the emotions, it is very useful to try to struggle with the habit of giving immediate expression to all one's unpleasant emotions. Many people find it very difficult to refrain from expressing their feelings about bad weather. It is still more difficult for people not to express unpleasant emotions when they feel that something or someone is violating what they may conceive to be order or justice. He goes on to add, besides being a very good method for self-observation, the struggle against expressing unpleasant emotions has at the same time another significance. It is one of the few directions in which a man can change himself or his habits without creating other undesirable habits. Therefore, self-observation and self-study must, from the first, be accompanied by the struggle against the expression of unpleasant emotions. This is the sum total of all, absolutely everything, that Ouspensky quotes Gurdjieff as saying about negative emotions. Or, as Gurdjieff himself seems to have actually called them, unpleasant emotions. In fairness, I must add a further comment actually made earlier in the book on page 56 by Ouspensky, only in the midst of a study of centres. He says, for instance, he, Gurdjieff, undoubtedly gave the fundamental basis for the study of the role and the significance of negative emotions, as well as methods of struggling against them, referring to non-identification, non-considering, and not expressing negative emotions. He did not complete these theories, or did not explain that negative emotions were entirely unnecessary and that no normal centre for them existed. These 3 paragraphs are effectively all that is said about negative emotions. Or, as Gurdjieff himself said, perhaps about the same thing, unpleasant emotions. In totality, in this book, In Search of the Miraculous. If we work on these 3 paragraphs, we arrive at a completely different understanding than that accorded later on, as we have already seen, second place in importance in Ouspensky's later teaching in London during the 1920s and 30s. But first, we need to look at the overall context in which they are introduced, which involves a slight diversion. In chapter 3 of his book, In Search of the Miraculous, Ouspensky is quite explicit about Gurdjieff's methods of teaching, which took place largely in St. Petersburg, in fortnightly meetings, during the period from the autumn of 1915 to February 1917. This total event, according to him, in a sense lasted just over 1 year, given that Gurdjieff himself was ill with pneumonia for the 2 months of November and December of 1916, and could not therefore travel to St. Petersburg at that time, and that also Ouspensky was conscripted into the military for 4 months at this same time. Ouspensky writes of this period, "There is no possibility of giving all these talks in the way they actually took place. For this reason, I collated all the psychological and all the cosmological material into 2 separate series of lectures." Ouspensky has already by this time divided Gurdjieff's teaching into 2 distinct and separate parts, even though it is made clear by him that Gurdjieff himself did not do likewise. Given the overall formula mentioned by both Gurdjieff and Ouspensky, expressed as the phrase, "as above, so below," it is not so clear to me that a division into psychological and cosmological theories is going to be a valid process. Ouspensky goes on to add what in fact becomes obvious, that in this connection it must be noted that the ideas were not given to us in the form in which they are set out in my lecture. How were they then given? Gurdjieff, how were they then given? Gurdjieff gave his ideas little by little, as though defending or protecting them from us. When touching on new themes for the first time, he gave only general principles, often holding back the most essential. Sometimes he himself pointed out apparent discrepancies in the themes given, which were in fact precisely due to these reservations and suppressions. The next time, in approaching the same subject, whenever possible from a different angle, he gave more. The third time, he gave still more. Gurdjieff's method of explaining his teaching to his pupils produced the following comment from his pupil Ouspensky: "The method of exposition of which I am speaking, and Gurdjieff's suppressions in his first talks, resulted in the creation of such misunderstandings, more particularly in later groups not connected with my work." And he then adds, "Many people found contradictions between the first exposition of a given idea and subsequent explanations, and sometimes in trying to hold as closely as possible to the first, they created fantastic theories having no relation to what Gurdjieff actually said." As to the overall context in which Ouspensky makes these remarks in his own book In Search of the Miraculous about the presentation Gurdjieff had made to Ouspensky and all the others as members of this group in St. Petersburg at that time, equally distinguished and remarkable men and women. For this group involved also Anna Butkovsky, who also later wrote about this period in a way that contrasts sharply with Ouspensky's perspective. It was in the context of an explanation of the existence of the different centres in man. Of this, Ouspensky writes quite definitely, "There are not 3 centres, but 5 in the ordinary man." Now, I have to say the following. Ouspensky has done a remarkable job in recording what Gurdjieff, according to him, was teaching during this period, and has actually very accurately quoted at times Gurdjieff's own words. However, in this respect, if we look at Gurdjieff and what Gurdjieff himself wrote, only in fact about 10 years later, in about 1926, in his book The Tales of Beelzebub to his grandson, we see clearly that Gurdjieff refers, through his hero Beelzebub, to the human beings living on the planet Earth as 3-brained beings, or on occasions as 3-centered beings. There is no mention of us anywhere ever in this book as 5-centered beings. And yet Ouspensky speaks in Search of the Miraculous of the fact that there were many misunderstandings and misinterpretations of what Gurdjieff taught, even in the very distinguished, experienced and extraordinarily intelligent other members of these Gurdjieff groups at that time. And he himself, Ouspensky, says quite clearly that there are not 3 centres in man, but 5. We can, I believe, here start to see, at the very least, the possibility that although Ouspensky himself displays no doubts, his understanding and interpretation of what it was that Gurdjieff was teaching at this time might itself even be something of a misunderstanding or a misinterpretation. It becomes a possibility to be considered. And now, gentle reader, you begin to tire, so let me return in stages to my original theme. We see that the quote given, and there are not so many quotes from Gurdjieff on this topic to choose from, says that one should try to struggle with the habit of giving immediate expression to all one's unpleasant emotions. And indeed, this phrase is given by Ouspensky, at least in the context of a talk about centres and about habits. Now, in addition, I myself have suggested that Gurdjieff's writings are inevitably, in the ordinary man, taken in at a superfluous level, giving an overall impression that it is about something which, upon further examination, is found to be not so, and more complex than initial acquaintanceship suggests. It may be that this speech displays the same characteristics, and so, as I said earlier, let's have some fun and examine this statement in more detail to ascertain whether, upon inspection, it retains its overall impression. What is this statement about? For example, might be a useful initial question. And we can say that it is certainly not about negative emotions, or even, as Gurdjieff always and correctly referred to them, unpleasant emotions. The subject of this phrase is a habit or custom. We should try to struggle with the habit, it says. And so it is not about negative emotions nor unpleasant emotions, which are expressed in this phrase in the possessive case. The subject of this phrase is a habit, that is to say, a previously learned coordinated activity of 3 centres, or a custom. A habit is the previously learned, either by accident or by repetition, coordinated activity of 3 centres, and a custom is the same previously learned coordinated activity of 3 centres, only learned in a social context and taught either deliberately or learned by imitation. To struggle in ourselves with the habit of giving immediate expression to all our unpleasant emotions is to struggle with this previously learned coordinated activity of all 3 centres, and has in fact nothing to do with the emotions nor with the emotional centre. It is about a habit. We experience an unpleasant emotion, and then we have learned, either as a custom or as a habit, to manifest, provoked by this in certain ways, through the moving centre, and also to attribute to this activity in the intellectual centre a negative slant or aspect, which in turn reinforces the unpleasant emotion that has initially provoked this coordinated process of all 3 centres, perhaps creating new and completely unnecessary other unpleasant emotions in a self-reinforcing process. To struggle with this is to struggle with this habit or custom, a coordination of all 3 centres, and does not involve in any way any struggle with the actual unpleasant emotions themselves, or any struggle within the emotional centre, neither of which should be attempted ever by, shall we say, the amateur. And that is about that as far as negative emotions go, in terms of what Gurdjieff himself actually wrote or said, even though he himself only ever referred to unpleasant emotions, the term negative coming only from the intellectual centre as a stance or attitude upon this complete process, and has no place in the emotional centre, which has its division into pleasant and unpleasant emotions, and not into positive or negative emotions. Gurdjieff is very accurate in referring only to unpleasant emotions and never to negative emotions, which in fact do not exist. And now one final comment, which will actually lead me quite nicely back to my overall theme, or the moral of my tale. We have the following quote from Gurdjieff, given by Ouspensky in his book In Search of the Miraculous. Gurdjieff is said to have said, "Besides being a very good method for self-observation, the struggle against the habit of expressing unpleasant emotions is one of the few directions in which a man can change himself or his habits without creating other undesirable habits." What I would like to point out here is the overall viewpoint that Gurdjieff takes leading to this quote just given. That is to say, what is the overall truth expressed by this quote if we take it, as it were, and transform it by our own methods to take away its superfluous character and see it, as it were, in reverse. It says that in the vast majority of cases, any change that we might make in ourselves and in our habits only leads, as Gurdjieff points out here, to other undesirable habits. We are getting very close here, therefore, to my original theme in this lecture, that any work on oneself does not work, and that any work on oneself only makes our situation worse, forming other undesirable habits which, unlike our existing habits and customs, have not, over long periods of time, become relatively harmonized and blended with our overall general existence, but which new habits are disharmonious and uncoordinated, making our situation more difficult and worse as a result. It is possible, therefore, that Gurdjieff here, in his overall background assumptions, is expressing the very truth that I too am explaining here in my own way. And so let us return, as I promised to do, to my original theme, and let me try to present the skeletal outline of the thinking and theorizing that have led me to the two quite definite statements made by me here, which we can then flesh out later both in theory and practice. Why is it that work on oneself does not work and only makes our situation worse? To introduce you to the overall skeletal structure of the process of thinking that has led me to these conclusions, I would like to introduce you here to three precepts, which I take from Gurdjieff's own writings in his own book, The Tales of Beelzebub to his grandson. They exhibit in their sequence what we might consider, according to Beelzebub himself, what is the problem with mankind as a whole and with us as individuals. Precept 2 follows logically from Precept 1, and Precept 3 follows from Precept 2 and Precept 1. They together, as explained by me here, present this outline of what it is that is wrong with us. And so we look at Precept 1. In his book, The Tales of Beelzebub to his grandson, Gurdjieff introduces as soon as he can, on page 6 into page 7 in fact, this precept. He writes, and I quote here from memory, you can verify the exact quote for yourself. You do not have to read very far, and many may even have read this quote already. In my opinion, he says, the trouble with you in the present instance is perhaps chiefly due to the fact that while still in childhood there was implanted in you an excellently working automatism. So far so good for those following the writings and teachings from the Gurdjieff tradition, everything written and produced about Gurdjieff and his teaching by other people, which might also be called endless stories about Gurdjieff and his life, and endless speculation based upon these stories. an excellently working automatism for what? We can ask. An excellently working automatism for perceiving all kinds of new impressions. So, this is precept 1, that we have an excellently working automatism for perceiving all kinds of new impressions. We perceive the world automatically, as Gurdjieff also writes, as endless repeated series of formally perceived impressions. Now, those among you who have read Ouspensky's book In Search of the Miraculous, or who are in the process of reading this book, as everyone should, we will find in this book a complete explanation of this automatic perception under the guise of what is called in this book the food of impressions. Ouspensky presents in his book 2 food diagrams which we shall see exhibit the contrast between the ordinary man at the start of the transformation that Gurdjieff mentions, and the normal man at the end of the transformation. In the first of these, that of the ordinary man, we shall see that what Ouspensky refers to as the food of impressions does not develop as a food as it should, but instead, shall we say, sounds in us merely as dough. It does not pass from dough to ray to me as it should, and as the other foods do, automatically according to the law of the octave. And so the first precept is that we have an excellently working automatism for perceiving all kinds of new impressions. In consequence of this, therefore, we receive neither the energies from these new impressions nor the data in the form of new impressions or new experiences that we should, as normal men and women, we remain ordinary and as people. This leads us, I am presenting a skeletal outline, remember, and so I may appear to hurry, but all that I mention briefly here will be explained in more detail later, and is of course explained completely in this book, The Tales of Beelzebub to His Grandson, by Gurdjieff himself, which anyone can read. Logically, to the second precept. The second precept is that because we have neither the energies nor the data which we should have, coming from the correct receipt of our impressions, we have nothing inside. Gurdjieff was reported to continually exhort his pupils that they had nothing inside, that they were empty, that they had no individuality, and that they had no being. Indeed, in his book, The Tales of Beelzebub to His Grandson, the great teacher, as Beelzebub calls him, the Mullah Nasreddin, says of us, there is everything in them, except the core, or even the kernel. We have nothing inside. We have no inner life. We are empty inside and do not know it, although we suspect something similar to be true. We have no real data to even think about this, let alone confirm it. We have nothing inside, the second precept. As a further result of this, because we have nothing inside and we have no inner life, as it were, churning away inside us, those energies that should come in their turn from this inner life are not present in us. for the maintenance and development of our own physical existence, our psychological existence, and our spiritual existence, such as it is. Therefore, in total desperation, merely to stay alive and to maintain our own existence, our physical selves and our psychological selves, and to hell with any spiritual aspects of our existence, we are forced to adapt over the long term to this situation. In all kinds of ways, in the outer part of the mind or psyche only, creating what Gurdjieff refers to almost 150 times in his book, The Tales of Beelzebub, to his grandson, as the abnormal external conditions of ordinary being existence established by us ourselves. This then is the third precept, that we, as ordinary men and women, live in the abnormal external conditions of ordinary being existence that each of us has established for ourselves over a long period of time. Needless to say, here, none of these three precepts is even mentioned in the writings and teachings of the Gurdjieff tradition. And I can add that this is despite the fact that the third precept, that we live in the abnormal external conditions of ordinary being existence established by us ourselves, is mentioned in the Tales of Beelzebub to his grandson about 150 times, is surely thereby unmissable and has a corresponding significance in Gurdjieff's own teaching. Let me mention here some aspects of this, not actually part of my series of lectures here, but of some interest and requiring some cautious handling in my opinion.